Welcome to Cause Before Symptom, uncovering the real cabal and spiritual forces that are controlling the world. And now, here is your host, James Carter.
Welcome to Cause Before Symptom. I'm your host, James Carter. Today, March 6th, 2026. And tonight's episode is all about Frankism. Jacob Frank, we're going to talk about the forgotten sect that the internet rediscovered. Yeah, I'm sorry to burst everybody's bubble, but that's not the real problem of what's going on worldwide. It's not a bunch of Frankists running the world, believe it or not. I know because I did the research, and we're going to find out a heck of a lot about this tonight. Now, Frankism is one of the strangest religious movements to emerge from 18th century Europe. Yet until recently, it remained largely confined to academic study. The movement formed around Jacob Frank, a self-proclaimed Messianic figure who appeared in Eastern Europe during the 1750s and claimed to carry forward the hidden mission of the earlier Messianic claimant Sabbatai Zevi. Frank's teachings shocked both Jewish and Christian authorities because he rejected established religious law and claimed that redemption required passing through and overturning the existing order. His followers eventually clashed with rabbinic leadership, publicly attacked traditional authority, and even underwent mass conversion to Catholicism in a dramatic and controversial turn of events. Despite the turmoil surrounding Frank and his followers, the movement itself was relatively small and short-lived. After Frank's death in 1791, leadership briefly passed to his daughter Eva, but the sect gradually dissolved as followers assimilated into surrounding European societies. By the early 19th century, organized Frankist communities had largely disappeared, leaving behind scattered historical records and a reputation as one of the most unusual Messianic sects in Jewish history. Now, in recent years, however, the name Frankism has suddenly resurfaced across the internet. Thousands of videos and discussions now claim the movement secretly survived and influenced modern geopolitics, particularly in connections with the conflicts in the Middle East and speculation about Messianic expectations. This show examines the historical evidence behind those claims, separating documented history from modern speculation. By tracing the origins of Frankism, the controversy it generated, and the reasons for its disappearance. The episode explores how a forgotten 18th century sect became a viral subject in the digital age, and why the internet has revived a story that history largely left behind. I'm interested in tonight's story, especially about Frankism, because I'm seeing it's like a real hot topic right now online, and I want to nip it in the bud before people start to overreact, because when something comes out that you've never even heard of before, and everyone's pointing fingers to that, that's what everyone is. They're all Frankists. They all worship that deity, right? We have to stop and pause and look at the big picture, meaning go throughout all of history before we can actually make a decision here. And to pinpoint everything back into one religion like Satanism, Hermeticism, even Catholicism, or even Christianity, you can't just lump them all together and say, here it is, because that's not how history has worked. It's chaos of all different types of belief systems. And to pinpoint it down just to one entity, well, that's not good journalism. And it doesn't make sense when you read history. So we're going to learn all about that tonight. Shout out to everybody on the live chat Rumble, #1 warrior, many times watchman. Watchman00021 says, I commented a bunch of books you should read on your TikTok, James, with an exclamation. I saw them. I will look at them. Thank you. Next is Noel1888. Noel says, good morning. What's up, Noel? Good morning. Good evening. And next is Scorpion. He's not number one anymore. Scorpion says, hey, y'all, hope all is well and blessed. The nukes ain't flying yet, so that's good. Well, I don't think they're gonna. Boots Hafner's the number 3 warrior. 1, 2, 3, 4. Number 4 warrior saying, all right, Pastor James, voice of the Rumble Airwaves and creator of the award-winning detoxifier elitepotion.com. Thank you, Boots. It's real. It is for sale. And you know what? Heavy metals and parasites are what's killing us. That's what I believe. And I've been taking this stuff and I feel a heck of a lot better and I'm happier and I have more energy. And, everything that you eat tastes like metal after you take this stuff. So you start to realize that, oh my God, metal is in every food that we're eating. And it is. It's hard to believe, but if it's being sprayed on us, then it's in our food. And therefore, it's trying to turn us Metallica. Anyway. And he says, hello, Warrior family. Glad to see y'all. Let's all hit that thumbs up for our host. Thank you. Yes, if you can all do me a favor. Take your thumb, follow me, go down to your phone, hit the X button, then hit thumbs up. Looks like I'm the only one that hit thumbs up so far. And then hit live chat. And you will help me gain more of an audience. Otherwise, it doesn't matter how many people watch the show. It matters how many people who like my show. And that's what's going on. All right, guys, let's get straight into breaking news.
Welcome to Shitty Breaking News with your host, James Carner, offering his shitty opinion.
Well, it is. Trump demands unconditional surrender from Iran as Putin speaks about the whole thing. Unconditional. They're not going to surrender. Now, the Iranian people are happy that America's beating the shit out of it. But Iran's been ready for this war for a long time, and they've been building all kinds of a stockpile to fight against the big bad Americans. Well, this thing could drag on a hell of a lot longer than 4 days or 2 weeks or even maybe 2 years. Yeah. They may have jumped the gun with this one, but we know who asked for all of this to happen. That was Netanyahu, who has Trump sitting on his thumb and doing everything that he wants because, Trump is a Zionist and they believe that their God is coming and they got to prepare the temple for it. And all of their religion all boils down to the return of the Messiah. And Bibi really believes that he is going to be the one that hands the scepter. This is the spear that pierced Jesus' side, the spear of Longinus, over to the Antichrist. And these guys are all psycho, okay? I'm serious. They're mental if they believe that we're really in those times. Now, I've told you guys in the past, Bibi was told by a really powerful and old rabbi that he was going to be the one giving the spear to the Antichrist, well, their Messiah. But regardless, all of this is about bringing in a king of the world. And they really think that Israel is going to be the center of everything. And it's looking like they're trying to expand Israel, right? And they're going to take over all these other countries like Syria and eventually Iran and spread their wings, and all commerce should go through Israel. Well, Russia and China don't like that. They're not fans of, Zionism. And so they're going to have problems with Russia and China as they help Iran, even though they can't really get involved physically or through their countries. They can only help anywhere they can. But regardless, there are rumors that America's stockpile's running out. Well, Iran isn't. So however long they can hold out for this, just like what Russia and China told Iran to do, is what we're going to watch. So we're going to basically just continue going through that. Watchmen, stay on topic here, pal. We're on Frankism. We're not talking about other books that I should read on my show. Okay, I appreciate what you're doing, but I can't stop and then start reading everything you say. It's like, hey, go here, go there, go there. Now, on TikTok, sure, I can write down everything you're saying, but you've got to give me a little bit of leniency when it comes to the show, because this is about Frankism tonight, right? So there you have it. Obama slams Trump at Jesse Jackson's funeral without naming him. Who cares? The U.S. military was targeting an area near a bombed Iranian school. Okay. Yeah, that's just going to be war, 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 war is all we're going to hear. Justice Department releases missing Epstein documents with Trump allegations. Dude, if you've got the data, arrest them. That's all I'm saying. You know, I don't care if you're the king. If you've got the data that Trump is a bad guy, arrest him. Why not? Then arrest everybody else who are the bad guys if you've got the evidence. But regardless, this is just crap. Just a bunch of phony nonsense. As Trump focuses on Cuba, Department of Justice seeks charges against its leaders. Ooh, who cares? Hexathon reports Russia aided Iran. Well, they have been. Anything that shouldn't be happening, what I was saying, anything that shouldn't be happening will be confronted strongly. Well, I don't know how much more you can sanction Russia. I don't know how much more you can sanction China without just stop buying their shit. But, you know, we're not ready for that. That's what I'm saying. Anyway. All right. So that's basically it. It's all shit. It's all crap. It's war and rumors of war. Now, if you're a Christian, you should have enough discernment and wisdom to understand that you are taken care of. God will keep you safe. That's what the Bible says. If you read the children of Israel, as they've gone throughout the desert and as they built up their kingdoms and worshiped Baal, and then went back to God, then worshiped Baal again, those that continued to follow God, God honored and kept them safe. So that's what we should be under the understanding of, and not freaking out about World War III or nukes, okay? Nobody makes money on the whole nuke thing. So maybe they'll launch a couple in the Middle East, and then maybe they'll use that to get everyone to batten down the hatches and stay in your houses, and then they can, you know, spy on us better. But regardless, sensationalism is off the charts tonight, and we really need to just stop, take a step back, breathe, and chill out. Because, dude, this stuff happens all the time, and it's not going to stop. You know, everyone seems to think that there's going to be a stop to all of this. There's not. Not until, if you believe in Jesus, Jesus actually returns finally, and court is in session. But until then, these are the things that we must be used to and not worry about, all right? All right, when we come back after the commercial break, we're going to be talking about Frankism, which is the forgotten sect that the internet have rediscovered, and they're pointing the blame right over there on all of the Satanists and bad guys.
Why do 75% of people feel exhausted all the time? The answer might surprise you. In the 1920s, Standard Oil decided to dive into medicine. They pushed synthetic petroleum into our drugs. Sure, it masked symptoms, but it wrecked our guts. Our good bacteria, which fight off parasites and heavy metals, got wiped out by crude oil. But here's the good news. We can fix this by going back to nature. Introducing Elite Potion, the world's top detox program. It restores your good bacteria by removing toxic threats like aluminum, strontium, barium, and parasites. Imagine feeling energized and alive again. They said there couldn't be a pill that did it all. We invented it. Visit elitepotion.com and reclaim your health from synthetic pharmaceuticals. Your body will thank you.
Every year, millions of Americans sign a contract they don't even know exists. They think it's just another tax return, but that signature means something far deeper. It starts with that first job at 16. The system takes a piece of her check, then promises to give some back. if she signs the return. Every April 15th, the same cycle repeats, not by law, but by belief. The system didn't bind them, their own signature did. Learn the truth at unincorporatedassociations.com.
All right, we're getting into Frankism now. So every so often, the internet resurrects something or a word that most people have never even heard of before. Now, I've heard of Frankism in the past, but I've never had the more interest to actually look into it and do a deep dive, because I didn't see any of the people that I used to watch even cover it. They never even really touched on it. And they're bringing out Frankism right now as if the idea of Frankism is that you are to hurt the entire world in order to get into heaven. So that's what we're going to be talking about. And we're going to be educated. Now, this is a name, Frankism, that sat quietly in the footnotes of history, suddenly just started to appear everywhere. And videos are now made about it, and articles are circulating, and researchers are beginning to argue over Frankism. Within weeks, the topic spreads across the entire digital landscape, and people begin to wonder whether something hidden has been just uncovered. Well, one of those words is Frankism, and for many listeners, this may be the first time that they have ever heard the name. Yet over the last few years, thousands of videos and posts have begun suggesting that Frankists secretly control world events, that they manipulate religious movements, or that they are trying to usher in a new Messianic age. Some claim the sect never disappeared. Others insist it operates behind the scenes in global politics. Now, whenever a story like this appears, a responsible investigation must begin with a simple question. What does the historical record actually say? And I spent hours today downloading every book I could find on it, every website I could find on it. I mean, I'm telling you, anything I could get on it. I was literally uploading it into artificial intelligence and trying to figure out, what does this have to do with the Satanists? What does this have to do with the baby eaters? What does this have to do with the rituals and, World War III, Iran and Israel expanding their territory? Well, we're going to get to those answers. Now, long before the internet rediscovered the name Frankism, historians had already studied the movement surrounding a man named Jacob Frank. His story begins not in modern geopolitics, but in 18th century Eastern Europe. In a world of religious tension, political upheaval, and Messianic expectation, Frank claimed to carry forward the mission of an earlier figure who had shaken the Jewish world a century before him. That earlier upheaval created the conditions that allowed Frank's message to take root. What followed was one of the most unusual religious controversies of the 18th century. Communities were actually divided. Religious authorities declared heresy. Public debates erupted. And at one point, thousands of Frank's followers even underwent baptism into the Catholic Church in an event that shocked observers all across Europe. Yet despite the drama surrounding the movement, something remarkable happened over time. The sect gradually disappeared. Its communities dissolved, its followers assimilated into surrounding societies, and its name faded into the archives of history. Now, for more than a century, Frankism remained a topic studied mainly by scholars of religious history. It was not considered a major force in global politics or modern institutions. It was a strange episode in the past, sure. It was controversial, it was fascinating, but largely confined to its historical moment. Now, the digital age then arrived, and then suddenly the name Frankism began appearing everywhere. researchers, commentators, and video creators started connecting the movement to modern geopolitical events, religious expectations, and theories about hidden networks of influence. A sect that historians once described as small and short-lived was now being portrayed as a secret force behind world affairs. Now, in the past, I used to jump on stuff like this and go, yep, that's what it is. They're all Frankists. They're worshiping Frank. And they're sacrificing babies for Frank. And all of them are doing human trafficking for Frank. I know I'm being a little facetious. But my point is, I used to not have a filter. I used to not have wisdom and discernment to stop myself from releasing information that isn't accurate, which I think is absolutely crucial and important if we are to be children of the Most High, especially Christians, because we can't play the devil's game and beat the devil that way. The devil is the liar. He's the father of it. We are Christians. Our job is to tell the truth because the truth makes you free. And the only way to fight against the devil is the truth. And you can't do it through assumptions. So tonight we're going to do something very simple but very important. We are going to step away from speculation and return to the historical record. Who was Jacob Frank? What did his followers actually believe? Why did their movement cause such an outrage among both Jewish and Christian authorities? And perhaps most importantly, what happened to the sect after its founder died? By examining the evidence carefully, we may discover that the truth about Frankism is both more surprising and more instructive than the theories that now surround it. Meaning, we're going to learn some new things that nobody's actually talking about Frankism today. And because sometimes the most interesting question is not whether a hidden movement is controlling the present, sometimes the real question is why the present suddenly becomes fascinated with a forgotten story from the past. Now, I'm not saying that Frankism is not behind these institutions that are influencing politics. It could be, but there's no evidence to support it. So we can't just jump on that. And in the future, whenever I actually do research, I look for breath stealing. Anything that steals the breath or talks about the breath. I wrote The Breath War to give you guys an understanding on how the world really works between the esoteric and the good. And the esoteric are focusing on taking the breath of the good. And I argue my case for the breath theft. But we're not going to get anywhere unless we look at these types of topics and then compare it to, if Frankism, are they the ones stealing the breath from people? Well, we'll find out. So to understand Jacob Frank and the movement that would later bear his name, this story must begin nearly a century earlier with an event that shook the Jewish world to the core. In the mid-17th century, a man named Sabbatai Zevi, I don't even know if I'm pronouncing it right, I don't care, rose to prominence across the Ottoman Empire and parts of Europe by declaring himself the long-awaited Jewish Messiah. I'm Jesus. It's basically what he was saying. His message actually spread rapidly through Jewish communities that had endured centuries of exile, persecution, and uncertainty. Many believers felt that history itself had reached a turning point. Sabbatai Zevi's rise was extraordinary. Jewish communities from the Middle East to Europe heard reports that the Messianic age had arrived. Letters circulated across continents announcing that redemption was near and that the long exile of Israel was about to end. Entire communities began preparing for the restoration for the kingdom of God. The excitement was so widespread that historians often describe the Sabbatian movement as one of the most powerful waves of Messianic expectation in Jewish history. And keep in mind, back then, the Temple Mount was controlled by Islam. And it was still called Palestine back then. There was no Israel till the Rothschilds came in. And this could have been some part to get that going. We don't know. But the movement collapsed almost as suddenly as it had begun. In 1666, Zevi was arrested by the Ottoman authorities, the Ottoman Empire, and faced the possibility of execution. Well, instead of dying for his claims, he made a shocking decision. He converted to Islam. What? Yeah. For many followers, the announcement felt like a catastrophe. The man that they believed to be the Messiah had publicly abandoned the faith of Israel. And communities that had celebrated redemption were suddenly forced to confront humiliation and confusion. You see, right there, right off the bat, if that Messiah converted to Islam, this kind of takes all the it's not Jacobism because that's a different movement, but the Frankist movement doesn't give it much, I would say, weight. Now, most believers responded by abandoning the movement altogether. The Messianic dream appeared to have failed. And let me take a step back. Watchman, I wasn't trying to scold you. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to break your heart. When I'm doing the show, I like to have things a little bit on the show and not to be steered off into somewhere else because, well, for me, if I'm doing a live show on a subject, I really need help with the subject, not on other things that I just don't have time to focus on when it comes to being live. But when we do TikTok, you can ask away. No big deal because that's not scripted like I built this show. All right, so most believers responded by abandoning the movement altogether. The Messianic dream appeared to have failed, yet a small group of followers took a very different approach. Rather than rejecting Zevi, they began reinterpreting the event in a radical way. Some argued that the Messiah's descent into another religion was not a failure, but a part of a mysterious divine plan. And in their view, redemption might require passing through darkness before light could emerge. So this reinterpretation created a hidden undercurrent that continued long after Zevi himself had faded from the public stage. Small circles of believers kept the hope alive that the Messianic mission had not ended, but had simply moved into a concealed phase. And over time, these groups developed ideas about secret knowledge, hidden redemption, and the belief that history was unfolding according to a deeper spiritual drama. So it was within this atmosphere of lingering Messianic expectation that Jacob Frank would eventually appear, nearly a century after Sabbatai Zevi's dramatic rise and fall. Now, Frank stepped into the stage claiming that the unfinished story of the earlier movement had now reached its final chapter. To his followers, he would present himself not merely as another teacher, but as the one who could lead believers through the last stage of redemption. Now, the seeds of Frankism, therefore, were planted long before Frank himself emerged. They were born in the shock of a failed Messianic movement and the determination of a small group of believers who refused to accept that the story had ended, and in the conviction that hidden truths still remained to be revealed. So, nearly a century after the dramatic rise and fall of Sabbatai Zevi, the Jewish communities of Eastern Europe were still living in the shadow of that earlier upheaval. So officially, the movement surrounding Zevi had been condemned and rejected. Rabbinic leaders had worked for decades to restore stability and reaffirm the authority of traditional religious law. Yet beneath the surface, fragments of the earlier Messianic hope still lingered among small groups of believers. Now, into this environment stepped a man named Jacob Frank. And it looks like Loki says, hello, friend. It's new tick money. What's up, Loki? Thanks for being here, pal. Good to have you. So Frank was born in the early 18th century in a region that today lies between Poland and Ukraine, an area where Jewish communities lived alongside Christians, Muslims, and various trading cultures of the Ottoman and Eastern European worlds. As a young man, he traveled widely, spending time in territories controlled by the Ottoman Empire, where remnants of the Sabbatai movement still survived. It was there that Frank encountered circles of believers who continued to interpret the legacy of Sabbatai Zevi, who switched to Islam in unconventional ways. And by the time Frank returned to Eastern Europe in the 1750s, he had begun presenting himself as a spiritual leader, carrying forward the hidden mission that earlier Sabbatians believed had not been yet completed. Now let's take a step back. Jesus never offered hidden information. He never offered secrets. He never said that there are hidden secrets that can help you find him. And immediately when anybody comes out and starts to say that this is the hidden book of, we must stop, pause, look, research, pray, and then line it up with the Bible. Right? Well, his message resonated with individuals who were already familiar with the story of Zevi and who believed that redemption might still unfold through unexpected paths. So Frank's claims were very bold. He did not simply describe himself as a teacher or a reformer. Instead, he suggested that he stood at the center of a divine drama that had been unfolding for generations. According to Frank, history had moved through different religious stages, and humanity now stood at the threshold of a new spiritual era that would transcend the boundaries of the old order. Now, this idea immediately set Frank apart from traditional Jewish teaching. Rabbinic Judaism emphasized the authority of the Torah and the interpretations developed through centuries of scholarly debate. Frank's message, however, suggested that the established system was only a temporary stage within a larger spiritual journey. It's already sounding like it's going New Age. Now, in his view, believers had to pass through these structures of existing religions in order to reach a deeper truth hidden beyond them. Just like that one dude did, Levy. And such claims quickly attracted followers who were already dissatisfied with the religious divisions and uncertainties of the time. Now, some saw Frank as a charismatic leader capable of reviving the lost promise of the Sabbatean movement. Others were drawn to the idea that history itself was approaching a moment of transformation. Now, at the same time, Frank's teachings raised alarms among religious authorities, and the memory of Sabbatai Zevi, Zevi, failed Messianic movement was still fresh in the minds of many leaders. It's only been 100 years since he started that movement. Now, any suggestion that another figure might be claiming a similar role was bound to provoke concern. Now, what began as a small circle of followers soon developed into a movement that could no longer remain hidden. Word of Frank's teachings spread across communities, drawing both curious listeners and fierce critics. Within a few years, Jacob Frank would find himself at the center of one of the most controversial religious disputes of 18th century Eastern Europe. Now, as the movement surrounding Jacob Frank began to grow in the 1750s, it quickly became clear that his message was unlike anything the established religious authorities of Eastern Europe had encountered in generations. Now, the Jewish communities of the region had worked very hard to rebuild stability after the earlier turmoil caused by Sabbatai Zevi. Rabbinic leaders had reinforced the authority of traditional law and warned believers about the dangers of false Messianic movements. Now, Frank's teachings, they threatened to reopen those wounds. And one of the central controversies surrounding Frankism was its challenge to the authority of established religious law. Rabbinic Judaism was built upon centuries of interpretation and commentary surrounding the Torah and the traditions preserved in the Talmud. Now, for Jewish communities, these texts provided the structure that governed religious life, ethics, and community order. And this Frank dude is threatening to destroy all of that. And you know what the what the Pharisees are like when someone comes in, starts threatening to take down all of their traditions. Well, they hang them. Wasn't me. So Frank's message suggested that this structure was not permanent. Well, that can't be, right? And according to Frank, the history of faith had moved through different stages. Each stage had its own rules and systems of authority, but those systems were not the final destination. He taught that a new phase of redemption required passing beyond the boundaries of the old religious order. For critics, this idea sounded dangerously close to abandoning the foundations that had sustained Jewish communities for centuries. Another source of controversy was the secrecy that surrounded Frank's inner circle. Followers often spoke about hidden truths, which Jesus never did, and deeper meanings that were not fully explained to outsiders. Now, this secrecy fueled suspicion among religious authorities who feared that the movement was developing teachings that could destabilize communities already struggling with the aftermath of earlier Messianic upheavals. Now, Frank's leadership style also contributed to the growing tension. Rather than presenting himself as a humble scholar or interpreter of tradition, he adopted the posture of a charismatic figure with a unique spiritual role. Now, to supporters, this gave the movement a sense of purpose and direction. To critics, it appeared as another example of a self-proclaimed Messiah drawing followers away from established authority. Now, as rumors about the movement spread, Jewish leaders across the region began organizing responses. Now, rabbis warned their own communities about the dangers of Frank's teachings and attempted to isolate the growing circle of believers. The memory of the chaos caused by Sabbatai Zevi's movement made many leaders determined to prevent another religious upheaval from taking hold. So they had to do something. Now, what had begun as a small group of followers now stood at the center of a widening conflict. Debates intensified. Accusations circulated. And the controversy surrounding Frankism grew so large that it soon attracted the attention of authorities far beyond the Jewish community itself. So the stage was being set for a confrontation that would soon draw in the political and religious powers of the region. Now, as the teachings of Jacob Frank spread through Jewish communities in Eastern Europe, the response from rabbinic leaders and leadership grew increasingly urgent. The memory of the upheaval caused by the earlier Messianic movement surrounding Sabbatai Zevi, well, that was still fresh in everyone's minds. And religious authorities, they feared that another wave of Messianic enthusiasm could once again divide communities and undermine the stability they had struggled to restore. Now, rabbis across Poland and neighboring regions began investigating the reports surrounding Frank and his followers. What they found confirmed their concerns. The movement appeared to challenge the authority of traditional scholarship, and some followers openly criticized the structures that had governed Jewish religious life for centuries. Now, for leaders responsible for maintaining order within their communities, this was not simply a theological disagreement. It was a direct threat to the foundation of communal life. Now, let's take a step back here. Okay. I know everyone says the Jews rule the world, and I know everyone are angry at the Jews right now. I can't tell you that the Jews in Israel are even the real Jews of old. We don't know. We've been told that they are a mix between some older Jews and some newer Jews, or some that were converted through the Ashkenazi thing. Yeah, we've been told all of this stuff, but no one's ever really explained it enough to where we could see the bottom line, like the root of all of this craziness. But for this Frankism movement, this goes directly against the Jews 100%. So this is why scholars are confused. Why this whole thing is being brought up now, and the current Jews in Israel are being called Frankists. That's what we're trying to get to here, right? Now, I don't have all of the answers as to who is really controlling Israel, other than most proof we have is through the Rothschild banking system and the Balfour Declaration, and many countries who all agreed that Israel deserved their own state again. And they got lots of help from other countries and bankers, and it ended up becoming something that history wasn't prepared for, because the Bible says that the second temple was destroyed and the third temple became our bodies. So Frankism, when it came out, if there were Jews controlling the world at that time, would consider Frankism as a threat to their future Messiah coming. So this is why Frankism, it doesn't make sense as it being the satanic thinking engine behind what's going on worldwide, this control mechanism. So in response, back then, rabbinic courts issued formal condemnations of Frank and his teachings. We would expect that. And communities were warned not to associate with the movement. And followers were placed under religious bans intended to isolate them from the broader Jewish population. And these measures reflected the seriousness with which leaders viewed the situation. In Jewish law, such bans were among the strongest tools available for protecting communal stability. Yet the controversy did not remain confined within Jewish communities. As the dispute intensified, Frank's followers began seeking allies outside traditional structures of Jewish authority. And that's a no-no. You don't, I have to be careful with what I say. But the Jews are very traditional, and when it comes to their people and their laws, they don't like doing work with others outside their community. They're very focused on them and them only because they've been promised, that's what they believe, that they are the chosen people of God. But as the dispute intensified, Frank's followers began seeking allies outside traditional structures of Jewish authority. So some members of the movement argued that the rabbis had corrupted the original message of faith and that outside intervention was necessary to expose what they saw as religious corruption. Let me take another step back. I did a show on the Talmud and what I found. And I found just all kinds of things, but the one that really bothered me the most was they were talking about a 6-year-old girl being married to a rabbi or a priest or a bishop, and how much that 6-year-old would have to cost the bishop. And not only, and you got to understand the Talmud. The Talmud is just, it's the Torah on top, but then rabbis throughout the centuries, throughout decades and centuries, their interpretations of what they think that phrase means. And they went way off into a whole nother world where they are now buying 6-year-old children to be their wives. And it gets even worse in the Talmud, and I proved it, and you could go to my website, jamescarner.com, and you can see it for yourself, that they were arguing if the 6-year-old was pierced by wood or not, and would that make them cheaper? When I read that, I did not take the Talmud seriously anymore. That's sick. And so I won't ever, because I found it, I researched it, it's there. You have to really seek to find the correct one too. And I gave all of my sources. But it's sick. These rabbis were pedophiles. And they were arguing how much it would cost for them to have a child as their wife, and if they were wood penetrated or not, is the most disgusting thing I have ever heard. So we don't need Frankists to be the bad guys here. As those who follow the Talmud and believe in its teachings, and those are the ones that are running Israel, I think it's safe to say that whatever movement that's outside of Israel is probably a distraction like Frankism in order for us not to look at Talmud, to look at Judaism in Israel's Zionist world of the Kabbalistic faith, which is a bastardized version of Judaism. And we can go all into throughout history and find out how this became that and that became this. What really matters is those who are running Israel are Talmudists. They believe in the Talmud, and the Talmud talks about pedophilia, and not only just about marrying a 6-year-old, but disgusting acts of perversion with it. So back to Frankism, which I believe is just a distraction from the real Jews running America, or not, well, running America, running Israel, etc. And they're not even real Jews. They're the European Jews. So this strategy, well, let's take a step back so we know what we're back to talking about. Some members of the movement argued that the rabbis had corrupted the original message of faith, and outside intervention was necessary, meaning they had to go to their neighbors and another religious sect or different opinion to help expose the corruption. Now, it could be that the Frankists were just trying to expose the Talmud and how disgusting it was and how that type of a religion probably shouldn't be in charge of the world. But I digress. Now, the strategy that led to a remarkable development. Frankist representatives brought their accusations against rabbinic authorities before local Catholic officials. And in these complaints, they argued that the rabbis had distorted sacred teachings and that the Frankist movement represented a purer form of faith. Now, for Christian authorities who had long viewed the Jewish community through the lens of theological dispute, these accusations presented a complex and unexpected situation. Public debates were eventually organized between rabbinic representatives and members of the Frankist movement. These confrontations became dramatic spectacles in which both sides attempted to defend their positions before religious and political authorities. And the dispute centered on questions of scripture, tradition, and the authority of religious law. For the Jewish leadership, the goal was very clear: to demonstrate that Frank's movement represented a dangerous deviation from established faith. Now, for Frank's followers, the debates offered an opportunity to challenge the authority of the rabbinic system and gain recognition from outside powers. So the conflict only deepened the divisions within the community. What had begun as a theological disagreement had now grown into a public controversy involving multiple religious authorities and political institutions. The stage was set for one of the most unusual turns in the history of the movement, an event that would shock observers across Europe and change the trajectory of Frankism forever. This is the strange alliance with the Catholic Church. As the conflict between the followers of Jacob Frank and the rabbinic leadership intensified, the movement took an unexpected turn that few observers could have even predicted. Instead of remaining an internal dispute within Jewish communities, the controversy began drawing the attention of the surrounding Christian authorities who governed much of Eastern Europe at the time. Now, Frank's followers had already brought their grievances against the rabbis before local Catholic officials, maybe even showing them the Talmud and how they were purchasing 6-year-olds pierced with wood or not, arguing that the religious leadership of their own community had distorted sacred teachings, which I would agree they did, because the Torah does not talk about that, but the Talmud does. Now, for church authorities, this dispute presented a curious opportunity. For centuries, Christian institutions had viewed Jewish religious scholarship as being shaped heavily by the interpretations found in the Talmud. Now, a group had emerged from within the Jewish world itself that openly criticized rabbinic authority and challenged those traditions. In the late 1750s, the situation reached a dramatic moment. Large numbers of Frank's followers publicly declared their willingness to convert to Christianity. In 1759, thousands of members of the movement underwent baptism into the Catholic Church in a highly publicized event that stunned observers across the region. Yeah, these were Jews, now Christians. Now, nobles and church officials stood as sponsors for the baptisms, and the ceremony was presented as a significant victory for the Catholic Church. For many Christians, authorities, the conversions appeared to confirm that the Frankists had broken away from rabbinic Judaism and were embracing the Christian faith. Yet the deeper motivations within the movement were far more complicated. Frank's teachings suggested that believers had to pass through different religious systems as stages within a larger spiritual journey. Now, in this framework, Conversion was not necessarily the final destination, but part of a broader transformation. Now, this ambiguity soon created tensions between the Frankists and the Catholic Church that had welcomed them to begin with. While the baptisms were celebrated publicly, many church leaders began to question whether the movement truly accepted Catholic doctrine in the way ordinary converts would. Reports circulated that Frank continued to present himself as a unique spiritual figure and that his followers maintained a special loyalty to him rather than the traditional church authority, meaning they were probably tithing to Frank and not the Catholic Church. Now, for Jacob Frank himself, the alliance with Catholic institutions was both an opportunity and a risk. On one hand, the baptisms gave the movement protection from the rabbinic authorities who had actually condemned it. On the other hand, the church now expected the Frankists to live according to Catholic teaching. Well, the uneasy relationship did not last long. Suspicion grew among church officials, and Frank's teachings might represent another form of religious deviation rather than a genuine conversion. So within a few years, the movement that had briefly enjoyed protection under the church would find itself facing scrutiny from those same authorities. So the dramatic mass conversions had solved one problem for the Frankists, but created another. And instead of ending the controversy, the alliance with the Catholic Church pushed the movement into a new and even more uncertain phase of its history. Now, the uneasy relationship between the followers of Jacob Frank and the Catholic authorities did not last long. While the mass baptisms of Frank's followers had initially been celebrated as a victory for the church, suspicions soon emerged that the movement's beliefs were far more complicated than a simple conversion to Christianity. Believe me, it would not be really easy to go from legalism straight to Christianity because traditions, laws, all that stuff, and kind of going where you don't have to follow all that, but follow a different type because the Catholics were legalists, but it was different and not easy. And church officials began hearing reports that Frank continued to present himself as a unique spiritual authority, and his role went beyond the teachings of the church. Well, that can't happen. Although his followers had formally entered Catholicism, many remained deeply loyal to Frank himself and continued to treat him as a figure with special religious significance. Well, this raised serious concerns among the clergy, who had expected the Frankists to integrate fully into the structures of Catholic religious life. And eventually these concerns reached the attention of the ecclesiastical authorities responsible for overseeing the region. Now, investigations were launched into Frank's activities, and questions arose about whether his teachings were compatible with the doctrine of the church. What had begun as a celebrated conversion movement was now being reevaluated as a potential source of religious confusion. In the early 1760s, the situation reached a turning point as Frank was arrested by church authorities and then placed under confinement in the fortress monastery of Czestochowa. Now, the imprisonment lasted for many years, effectively removing him from public leadership of the movement itself. Yet the imprisonment did not destroy Frank's influence among his followers. In fact, for many believers, it had the opposite effect. Stories circulated that Frank's suffering was part of a larger spiritual mission, and that his confinement represented a stage in the unfolding drama of redemption. Now, within the movement, his imprisonment was sometimes interpreted not as defeat, but as a sign of deeper spiritual significance. So followers continued to correspond with him, and the legends surrounding his role grew during this period. The idea that their leader was enduring hardship for the sake of a hidden divine plan reinforced the loyalty of those who remained committed to the movement. Now, when Frank was eventually released years later, he emerged into a new phase of his own leadership. By that time, his reputation among his followers had taken on an even more elevated status. No longer simply a controversial teacher, he had become the center of a tightly knit community that treated him with a level of reverence approaching that was given to a Messianic figure. So he became Jesus. Now, Frank established a kind of court-like environment around himself, gathering loyal followers who viewed him as the guiding authority of their spiritual journey. Visitors reported a community organized around his presence, where devotion to a leader had become one of the defining characteristics of the movement. What had begun as a religious controversy within Jewish communities had now evolved into something quite different. A charismatic movement centered almost entirely on the personality and authority of Jacob Frank himself. When those movements hit, others see opportunities. When I say others, people who want profit, people who want to make money. And this could have happened with this movement as well, not just them being Satanists or Luciferianists or wizards or warlocks or witches. It could just simply be that the way that they were learning this made more sense to them at the time than the current Torah. And especially when rabbis were going far off into la-la land of disgustingness, that anything's got to be better than that. So money, power started creeping in, and that's how movements like Frankism begin. Now, what had begun as a religious controversy had turned into something different. The worship of Jacob Frank himself. That's what they did. Now, by the time Jacob Frank died in 1791, the movement that had once caused such controversy all across to Eastern Europe had already began to change in character. During his lifetime, Frank himself had been the center of authority. His personal charisma, bold claims, and reputation as a spiritual guide had held the community together. But without that central figure, well, the future of the movement was uncertain. So leadership of the remaining followers passed to his daughter, Eva Frank, who had grown up within the inner circle of the movement. Eva inherited not only the symbolic role associated with her father, but also the responsibility of maintaining a community that had been organized almost entirely around his presence. For a time, she succeeded in preserving the structure that Frank had established. Followers continued to gather around the household and maintain the traditions that had developed during her father's leadership. Reports from the period describe a community that still carried elements of courtly ceremony and loyalty to the Frank family. Yet the movement was no longer expanding in the way it had during Jacob Frank's earlier years. Without the dramatic confrontations and public controversies that had once drawn attention to the sect, the community slowly turned inward. Many followers had already integrated into the societies around them through the Catholic baptisms that had been taking place decades earlier. As generations passed, it became increasingly difficult to maintain a distinct identity separate from the broader European culture in which they now lived. Keep in mind, they went from Judaism to Catholicism They were relying on Frank's interpretation of the Bible. And whatever he was saying, they were believing. And then when he died, they're now Christian, and they still don't understand the Bible because they're taught Frank's version of it. Thus, it would be short-lived. And again, this is in Eastern Europe. Now, political and social changes across Europe also played a role in the movement's gradual decline. The late 18th and early 19th centuries were periods of enormous transformation, marked by shifting borders, revolutions, and new social structures. Within this rapidly changing environment, small sectarian communities often found it difficult to preserve their original identity. After Eva Frank's death in 1816, the remaining cohesion of the movement began to fade. Without a charismatic leader to unify the followers, the sect gradually dissolved into the surrounding societies. Former members and their descendants blended into local communities, and the distinctive identity that had once set them apart, well, it slowly disappeared. By the early 19th century, Frankism had largely ceased to exist as an organized movement, and what remained were scattered references in historical records, memoirs, and religious debates from the period. The once controversial sect that had stirred such intense reactions from both Jewish and Christian authorities had become a historical memory rather than an active force. So in the decades that followed, Frankism would be studied mainly by historians, attempting to understand the religious upheavals of the 18th century. But few have imagined that more than 200 years later, that the name would suddenly reappear in the modern digital world, sparking new waves of speculation and curiosity. Doesn't that make sense? This and their ways, they went from Judaism to Christianity. Where are they Satanists here? How did Frankism become Satanists? Because the documented history of Frankism doesn't talk about worshiping the devil. It doesn't. And all of a sudden, we're seeing video after video after video after video after video after video of people saying they're Frankists. They're Frankists. They're Frankists that are in Israel, and they're Frankists and they're devil worshippers. They haven't even done any research on what Frankist is. I didn't even know what a Frankist was until today. And so this should be a huge lesson for all of us, that the moment you see someone say, this is what it is, we have to stop, research, discern, and then come back around and judge it against the Bible. Does it fit and flow with what the Bible says? And even the Ethiopian canon. And that's why we're doing our due diligence of examining between the Ethiopian and the King James. And I really do believe that this whole new pointing the finger has to do with the Epstein files and all the Satanism that's wrapped up in that. Well, I believe the Mossad or Israel or anybody who is involved in that type of a thing that's been hidden in secret up until it's coming out now through the Epstein files. They're trying to get ahead of the narrative here. And they need us to blame anything but Talmud Jews. But I think it's already too late. They're already a thorn in the side of the entire world. That does not mean that this whole event with Iran is going to bring in World War III. In fact, I don't think anybody's really going to win this war. It's just going to die out, and Iran will go back to doing what they do, and the United States will be in more debt. Now back to Frankism. So by the early 19th century, the movement that had once stirred so much controversy all across Eastern Europe had largely faded from view. And after the death of Eva Frank, well, the last recognizable center of leadership within the community had disappeared. Without a figure capable of uniting the remaining followers, the structure that had formed around her father, Jacob Frank, well, gradually dissolved. Several factors contributed to this quiet disappearance. One of the most important was the social environment in which the Frankists now live. Many members of the movement had already undergone public baptism into the Catholic Church decades earlier, and that decision, originally made as part of the dramatic conflict with rabbinic authorities, had the long-term effect of integrating the community into the surrounding Christian society. And over time, the descendants of these families blended into the broader population, making it increasingly difficult to maintain a separate religious identity. Another factor was the absence of strong leadership after the Frank family's direct influence ended. They didn't have any real, I would say, a plan, a company, a group of people that could continue the work. It just literally died. And something like that usually has something that comes out, and they build a structure to keep it going. But this didn't have that, because as we're finding out, it died with Eva. Now, movements build around charismatic figures often struggle to survive once that central personality is completely gone. And Frank's authority had been deeply personal, as followers that saw him as the guiding force behind their spiritual path, well, they don't have their questions being answered. Loki says, well, I don't know if you covered it, but the main point with Joseph Frank is he was one of the three that started the Illuminati. So now we know the theology of the Illuminati. That's all I got from it. Him and Adam Weishaupt and Roth. Well, it's more than likely that their theology of what they were believing at that time kind of fit with whatever views that they had at that time. But building the Illuminati and Adam Weishaupt and Albert Pike and all of them who believed in Luciferianism, well, that doesn't prove that they are the ones controlling Israel. That doesn't prove that they are controlling America. That doesn't prove that they are controlling the UK or Iran or China or Russia. It just proves that those were people who were institutions that steered opinion and steered policy towards their way, but they are just a handful of people versus others who just didn't agree with their philosophies. But they did bring in power. Of course they did. And the Freemasons did bring in power. Of course they did too. But it's not proof that Satan and all of these other countries are all ruled by the devil. That's what I'm trying to say. I used to think that. I used to. But I don't have supporting evidence to point the fingers at where the trail leads to and how it all comes from one root, because it doesn't. It comes from several roots. And that's the chaos of this whole thing. And honestly, I felt it to be disappointing that I'm not finding the origin of where all of these elite billionaires and their belief systems come from. Because it's, and scholars are looking at this and agreeing with this, it's from everywhere. Thus, it's a spiritual thing, and that's hard to prove. You can't prove that they worship the devil. You can only find slivers and sediment and fingerprints that they were there. but there's no video of the rituals themselves. So Frank's authority had been deeply personal. Followers saw him as a guiding force behind their spiritual path, and when the personal leadership vanished, the internal cohesion of the group weakened, obviously. So the broader political environment of Europe also played a role. The early 19th century was a period of dramatic transformation across the continent. Empires shifted, borders moved, and new political structures emerged. And in times of such upheaval, smaller religious sects often found it difficult to maintain their original identity. So communities that once stood apart frequently dissolved into the larger societies around them. And by the mid-19th century, historians studying Jewish religious movements began to treat Frankism as a closed chapter in the past. So the sect appeared primarily in historical records discussing the aftermath of the earlier Messianic movement associated with Sabbatai Zevi. And scholars described Frankism as the final radical expression of that earlier upheaval, rather than as an enduring tradition moving forward, or a bunch of people using this and performing rituals and rites underneath this movement. So for more than a century, the name rarely surfaced outside academic discussions. Libraries preserved the documents, historians debated the meaning of the movement, and students of religious history examined the strange path that had led from Sabbatai Zevi to Jacob Frank. But beyond those scholarly circles, the story remained largely forgotten. And what makes the present moment unusual is that this long-forgotten name had suddenly returned to public conversation. A sect that historians believed had disappeared 200 years ago and is now being discussed across digital platforms as though it still operates in the modern world. Well, as I've said, evidence will show there would be fingerprints, there would be, deer tracks to follow where it is, and there just isn't. And understanding how and why that revival of interest occurred, well, that's the next step in my investigation. Because sometimes history itself does not change, but the way people interpret history does. Loki says, it also happens that around that time the playbook Faust was published. They say art imitates life, and in that book they illustrate what they mean by redemption through sin. No doubt about it that I'm sure that that book gave, people ideas. Maybe there was some hidden meaning behind it, but none of this proves that there is an underground one world order society of Satanists. That's what I'm saying. If it is, there's no evidence for it. And I want to know this. And that's why I continue, searching for evidence. But I can't for the life of me follow people who are still saying that it's Frankist. The Frankists are behind it all. Because that I could set a better record saying that it's the Talmudists, it's the Zionists, it's the Eastern, or not Eastern, but the Western Jews who claim they're Jews. They're white Jews and not even brown, because Jesus was brown, and they're the ones occupying Israel, and they follow the Talmud, and the Talmud says it's okay to marry a 6-year-old. So I can make a better case for just the Jewish people that are there now than I can with Frankism or Satanism or Luciferianism or the Illuminati or the black nobility families. They probably are related and are making money off of it. But are they all in collusion together? I can't find their tracks. So back to Frankism. For more than a century after the decline of the movement surrounding Jacob Frank, the name Frankism remained largely confined to historical studies. And scholars examining the aftermath of the earlier Messianic movement connected to Sabbatai Zevi occasionally referenced Frank's followers when discussing the religious upheavals of Eastern Europe. Now, outside those academic circles, however, the subject, it rarely entered public conversation. Then, something unexpected happened in the digital age, just a few years ago. And over the past, let me take a step back. William Cooper never mentioned him, okay? Our godfathers of conspiracy theorists. William Cooper never mentioned Frankists. David Icke never mentioned the Frankists. Did David Icke? I don't think so. I'll have to check on that, but I don't remember hearing David Icke talk about the Frankists controlling Israel and, the devil worshippers. Neither did, oh my gosh. Go back to the 80s and 90s and the pioneers of conspiracy theories then, they weren't mentioning Frankism. It just wasn't part of their investigations. Why? Well, that's a huge clue, because I do believe that Frankism is being used now to steer us off the path of the Talmudists that are running Israel. And they're not running the world. They're not running China and Russia, I can tell you that. Then something unexpected happened. Over the past decade, the name Frankism began appearing with increasing frequently all across online platforms. And I did a Google search when it came to Frankism in Google Trends, and it started back in 2018. And Frankism went where it was barely discussed, and then all of a sudden, just way up there. So videos, podcasts, articles, and discussion threads started presenting the movement not simply as a historical curiosity, but as a hidden force operating behind modern political and religious developments. And for many viewers encountering these claims, the story sounded both mysterious and alarming. A sect that historians believed had vanished in the 19th century was suddenly being portrayed as a secret network influencing world events. We have to guard our hearts and figure out, hey, are they playing us? Well, I'm not saying that Frankism isn't true. I'm saying there's no evidence of it. They're good at covering their tracks, but I can't see Frankism as part of that, because it would have been discussed in the 30s, 40s, 50s after World War II. Building new ideas just wasn't. So several factors contributed to the sudden revival of attention, and one of the expanding accessibilities of historical material. Well, digital libraries, academic archives, and translated texts all made it easier than ever for independent researchers to encounter subjects that had once required specialized study. And what had been buried in university collections could now be discovered through a simple online search. So another factor was the way that modern communication platforms amplify certain topics. When a few creators begin discussing an obscure subject and their content gains traction, well, recommendation systems often spread the topic to wider audiences. And as more people search for information, the platforms promote additional material related to the same subject. And within a short time, a previously obscure topic can appear to be everywhere. So the story of Frankism also contains elements that easily capture public imagination. It involves Messianic claims, secret teachings, dramatic religious conflicts, and unusual alliances between communities that normally stood in opposition to one another. And when modern audiences encounter these themes while trying to interpret the uncertainties of contemporary geopolitics, well, some begin connecting the historical movement to present-day events. But in many cases, the modern discussions extend far beyond what was historically recorded and that it actually shows. Claims circulate suggesting that Frankism survived as a hidden organization or that its followers operate within powerful institutions today are just not true. And historians studying the movement consistently note that evidence for a continuous Frankist network after the early 19th century is extremely limited. So this gap between documented history and modern speculation reveals something really important about the way information spreads in the digital era. A forgotten chapter of history can reappear suddenly, not because the past has changed, but because the present has developed a renewed fascination with certain types of stories. And that's what I believe happened here. Now, Frankism provides a perfect example of this phenomenon. Now, if the historical record shows that the movement surrounding Jacob Frank largely disappeared by the early 19th century, then an obvious question remains. Why has the story suddenly returned to public discussion in the modern world? Well, part of the answer lies in the story itself. Frankism contains elements that easily capture the imagination. It involves a charismatic leader who claims to have a unique spiritual role, and a movement that challenged established religious authority, and dramatic confrontations within powerful institutions, and a sequence of events that included public debates, mass religious conversions, imprisonment, and the eventual disappearance of the sect itself. Now, these features make the movement both historically fascinating and highly adaptable to modern narratives. Another reason the story persists are periods of uncertainty when and often encourage people to search the past for hidden explanations. That's another reason. When geopolitical tensions rise or societies experience rapid change, while individuals naturally look for deeper causes behind the events unfolding around them. And historical moments, and movements that involve secrecy or controversial teachings can become symbolic tools used to explain modern anxieties. Well, in the case of Frankism, the story has been rediscovered during a time when many people are already examining questions about power, religion, and hidden influence within global institutions. Why? Because the movement once challenged both the Jewish and Christian authorities and involved a complex relationship with the surrounding political powers of its time. And it offers fertile ground for speculation about whether similar dynamics might even exist today. So understanding that distinction allows us to approach the subject with both curiosity and faith, power, and even caution. The historical movement was real, and its story remains one of the most unusual chapters in the religious history of Europe. But the revival of the story today tells us that as much about the concerns of the present as it does about the events of the past. Remember, we're in the age of deception along with the age of information, and we have to guard our hearts. So the story of Frankism is one of the most unusual episodes in the religious history of Europe. And in the 18th century, this man gathered followers, believed they were living through the final stage of the Messiah drama, and authority, established religious structures then provoked fierce opposition from rabbinic leaders and eventually led thousands of his followers to undergo baptism into the Catholic Church in a dramatic and controversial turn of events. But nowhere does it say that they're Talmudist or Satanist or Luciferianist or anything like that. And nor does it say that they believe that they have to do everything bad in order to get into heaven. No. So Frank and his movement stood at the center of conflict for a moment that did involve Jewish communities, Christian authorities, and political institutions all across Eastern Europe. And the movement did stir debates about scripture, tradition, and the nature of redemption itself. But I do believe it was used in order to get us to focus off of those who are in charge. Remember, Frank died, and so did his daughter. And the movement died with them. And historians and theologians all agree none of their stuff escaped underground. Now, what makes the moment unusual, it's not the existence of Frankism itself, but the sudden revival of interest in the subject. Well, in the digital age, a forgotten movement has been rediscovered and reinterpreted by thousands of researchers, commentators, and content creators searching for explanations behind the complexities of a modern world. Yet the historical record remains very clear, as Frankism was a real movement that emerged from a specific religious and cultural environment in 18th century Eastern Europe. And it did generate intense controversy, briefly captured the attention of powerful institutions, and eventually disappeared as its followers blended into the societies around them. So understanding that history allows us to separate documented events from modern speculation. Because the story of Frankism does not reveal a hidden organization guiding world affairs. Not this one. Instead, it offers a reminder of how powerful ideas can rise, disrupt established systems, and then fade into the archives of history. So we need to guard our hearts. So sometimes the rediscovery of such stories tell us that much about the present as it does about the past. In an age of rapid communication and global uncertainty, forgotten movements can suddenly reappear in the public imagination, just like we're witnessing today. Inviting new interpretations and renewed debate here is important, as we can hopefully remove ourselves from such things that are obvious and blatant lies. But the task of responsible research remains the same here: to follow the evidence, to examine the historical record carefully, and to understand the difference between what history actually shows and what later generations imagine it might mean. This has been Cause Before Symptom. I'm your host, James Carner. Tune in tomorrow night when God gives me another revelation to tell you guys all about. You can go to me, or go to my website at jamescarner.com, find out all about me. You can go and sign up for my newsletter. That's a really good way to get a hold of me, because, yeah, I get shut down everywhere. Well, I'm sorry. Frankism may be evil, but it's not what the leaders are doing, dude. I think it goes right to Talmud, goes right to the bastardized version of the Torah, and that is most likely Occam's razor. The simplest explanation tends to be the correct one. God bless you. See you guys. Mañana.
This has been Cause Before Symptom with your host, James Carner. Go to his website, jamescarner.com, and sign up for his newsletter. Also, download his free books on the breath war, the crown of blood, and the ritual machine. Fix your body by buying his award-winning detox formula, removing heavy metals and parasites. You'll feel better and live longer. Go to elitepotion.com. And one more thing, please. Just try and love your neighbor, because if you do, the world would be a better place. See you tomorrow.